Thanks for tuning into this episode of History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, where we explore history's greatest sieges. If you know somebody that enjoys this genre of history, please share the podcast with them, and please give it a review on your favorite app of choice. In the autumn of 1870, the armies of the newly ascendant German power encircled the capital of France. The war had already been decided on the battlefield. French forces had been shattered, their emperor captured, and their armies either surrendered or scattered. But one final struggle remained. The enemy wouldn't simply defeat France, it would break its spirit, humiliate it, and reshape the very balance of power in Europe. The siege that followed was more than a military campaign. It was a crucible in which modern warfare, urban resistance, and national survival were tested against the relentless weight of starvation and artillery. The men who fought and died in its streets, the civilians who endured hunger and disease, and the political forces that clashed within the city would not simply determine the end of a war, they would set the course for the wars to come. When the city finally fell, it was more than a simple surrender. It was a reckoning. The outcome redrew the map of Europe, gave birth to a new empire, and planted the seeds of a conflict that would engulf the world 4 decades later in World War I. The humiliation inflicted upon France in these months didn't fade with time. It festered, hardened, and became doctrine. The men who grew up in its aftermath would march into the trenches of 1914, driven by the memory of what had been lost. This siege did more than decide the fate of a city. It set the stage for the wars of the 20th century. Let's now experience the Siege of Paris.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, Episode 20, The Siege of Paris, the 18th of September, 1870, to the 26th of January, 1871. French forces, 355,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, and nearly 2,000 artillery pieces. Prussian and German forces, 206,000 infantry, 34,000 cavalry, and more than 1,100 artillery pieces. Paris' surrender marked the end of the Franco-Prussian War, a conflict that not only crushed the Second French Empire, but also gave birth to a new European superpower. In the wake of victory, the German Empire was proclaimed, uniting the fragmented German states under Prussian rule. The balance of power in Europe had shifted permanently. But the war did not simply end with treaties and territorial concessions. It left behind a deep, unresolved hostility between France and Germany, a resentment that would harden over the decades. The humiliation of 1871 was not forgotten. It was seared into the French national psyche. The loss of Alsace and Lorraine became an open wound, a national obsession, and a rallying cry for future war. This animosity would fester through the years, shaping diplomacy, military planning, and alliances. By 1914, when war erupted once again, it was not just a contest of empires. It was the unfinished business of a rivalry forged in the ashes of this war. The road to World War I did not begin with the assassination in Sarajevo. It began here.
By the middle of the 19th century, one state towered over the rest of Germany, Prussia. Its ascent was not built on diplomacy, commerce, or culture alone, but on the iron discipline of its soldiers and the steel of its will. The humiliation of 1806 through 1807, when Napoleon's legions shattered Prussia at Jena and Auerstadt, burned in the minds of its officers like a wound that would never heal. The Prussian military didn't simply rebuild itself, it swore an oath of vengeance against its own weakness. The memory of Frederick the Great loomed over them, an expectation to be met, a standard to be surpassed. Never again would Prussia be so humbled. From this crucible of defeat, Prussia forged a weapon no other nation possessed, the general staff. This was not just an office filled with scribes and clerks, but a war machine of intellect and precision, designed to master every aspect of the battle before the first shot was fired. In 1866, the world saw what the general staff could do. Austria, a great power in its own right, was brushed aside like an afterthought. The victory was swift, decisive, and left no doubt. Prussia was now the dominant German power, but this was merely the opening act. The real contest, the true reckoning, would come against France. Otto von Bismarck, the architect of German destiny, knew that war was more than just force. It was a tool of unification. a hammer to forge the German states into one empire. He pulled them together under Prussia's banner, creating the North German Confederation. But to complete the work, he needed fire, he needed fury, he needed France. A war with the old enemy would not just be fought on the battlefield, but in the hearts of every German, binding them together in blood and triumph. Across the Rhine, France was no longer the colossus it had been under Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon III, his nephew, sat on the throne. But the Second Empire was a pale imitation of the first. France still held ambitions, still saw itself as a great power, but the world had changed, and it was no longer the unchallenged master of Europe. When Prussia fought Austria, Napoleon III had stayed neutral, expecting rewards for his patience. He eyed the western banks of the Rhine, hoping to extend France's frontier, but Bismarck had no interest in appeasing French ambitions. Prussian victories were for Prussia alone. No land would be handed over to a foreign power. When France turned its gaze toward Luxembourg, hoping to buy it outright, Bismarck blocked the move without hesitation. It was a game of strategic denial. France would gain nothing. Prussia would give nothing. Napoleon III tried another move, economic domination of Belgium through its railways, a subtle but effective means of control. But Bismarck played his hand once more, whispering in Britain's ear of French ambitions along the Channel. The British, unwilling to see a French stronghold so close to their shores, crushed the scheme before it could begin. The final spark came from Spain, a vacant throne, a struggle for influence, and a candidate tied to Prussia. This was too much for France to bear. Bismarck, the master of statecraft, twisted the diplomatic knife with the infamous Ems Dispatch. A routine exchange between King Wilhelm I and the French ambassador was edited, sharpened, and unleashed upon the world. The message was clear. France had been insulted, humiliated. The French press raged. The public frothed with indignation. Napoleon III, boxed in by his own people, had no choice. War was coming. The French people were ready to fight. Their army was not. France had tinkered with its military, making small improvements here and there, but it was too little, too late. Against Prussia's war machine, they were outgunned, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered. Helmuth von Moltke, Prussia's cold and calculating master of war, had prepared for every possibility. The general staff had mapped the campaign before the first battle was even fought. Prussia's armies were vast, twice the size of France's, and ready to strike with the precision of a surgeon's blade. Moltke's plan was elegant in its brutality. Lure the French forward, stretch them thin, and snap the jaws shut. But an overeager Prussian general acted too soon, tipping their hand. The French hesitated, sensing the danger ahead, but hesitation was not enough to change their fate. The French advance faltered, slowed by uncertainty, but it didn't matter. Their fate had already been sealed. Napoleon III split his forces, positioning one army at Sedan and the other at Metz. In doing so, he handed Moltke the very thing he wanted: an enemy divided, easier to crush. The Prussians dominated every aspect of the fight: strategy, mobility, firepower. It was all in their favor. The French, overwhelmed and encircled, were trapped like animals. On September 1st, 1870, the hammer fell. At Sedan, Marshal MacMahon's army collapsed, and with it, the entire French Empire itself. 100,000 men surrendered, among them Napoleon III, a ruler now reduced to a prisoner. Metz held out for another month, but its fate was never in doubt. Marshal Bazaine, surrounded and starved, had no choice. Another French army laid down its arms. With France's army shattered, the road to Paris lay open. The Prussians marched forward, relentless and unchallenged. The beating heart of France was now within their grasp. Defiant and proud, Paris stood behind its walls. To the French, it was unbreakable. To the Prussians, it was already doomed. General Louis Trochu, the city's military governor, scrambled to assemble an army. He had professionals. The 13th Corps under General Vinoy, battle-worn soldiers from Sedan under Ducrot, and thousands of Marines and sailors. These men would fight. But the true weight of Paris's defense rested on untrained hands. The Garde Mobile were barely soldiers. The Garde Sédentaires were worse, armed civilians in uniform. Their courage was unquestionable, but courage alone could not win this war. 400,000 men stood ready, and the city's factories churned out weapons day and night. It would be a fight, but time was not on their side. On September the 18th, the Prussians reached Paris. By the next day, the city was encircled, locked in a Prussian death grip. Moltke knew better than to waste men against the city's forts. Instead, he settled in, ordering his men to dig deep and let starvation do the work of cannon and rifle. Paris had stockpiled food, enough to hold out for months. If the Prussians thought the city would break quickly, they were mistaken. But Moltke had an unexpected ally, the people of Paris themselves. As hunger and hardship set in, radical voices rose against Trochu's leadership. The communards, socialists demanding a new order, turned their anger inward. Paris, instead of uniting against the Prussians, began to devour itself. Trochu had to use his own forces to crush uprisings, rescuing officials from the mobs. The city was fighting two wars, one outside its walls, and the other within. If anyone could have held Paris together, it was Leon Gambetta. He was the face of the newly declared Third Republic, a man of vision and of fire. But instead of staying to tame the storm, he escaped in a hot air balloon, vanishing into the sky like a ghost. His mission? To raise an army beyond the city walls, to bring salvation to a Paris that was bleeding out. Trochu refused to sit and wait for death. On September the 30th, he ordered a strike against the Prussians, and at first it worked. The outer defenses gave way, but then came the wrath of the Krupp guns, their breech-loading cannons spitting death with brutal efficiency. The French fell back, beaten but not yet broken. The retreat was called according to plan, but no one truly believed it. 2 weeks later, another blow was struck. Trochu sent Vinoy south, hitting the Prussian lines at Châtillon and Bagnols. The French surged forward, taking ground, even capturing prisoners, but it was a pinprick against a giant. Their lines held. The war wouldn't be won with raids. The taste of even small victories gave Trochu hope, and on October the 21st, he gambled bigger. Ducrot was sent west toward St. Cloud and Bougival. The French stormed Buzenval, held it through wave after wave of Prussian counterattacks, and then slipped away before they could be overwhelmed. It was a textbook fighting retreat, skillful, disciplined, and defiant. But the people of Paris saw no glory in retreat. They saw only territory won, then given up. Their patience with Trochu was running thin. Inside the city, the cracks widened. The soldiers who fought and bled in the sorties looked back at the city and saw men drilling, not dying, and resentment boiled. Then came the news that crushed any flicker of hope. Metz had fallen. 150,000 men lost, an entire army gone. Paris was truly alone. But in the darkness, there was still some fight left. General Carré de Bellemare, acting without orders, struck at the Prussians. With boldness bordering on recklessness, he seized Le Bourget, and for a moment the city cheered. But the Prussians came back in full force, overwhelming the defenders and wiping them out. The celebration quickly turned to mourning. Le Bourget's fall and Metz's surrender were too much. Paris was no longer just under siege from the outside. Revolt flared within. The communards rose again, this time storming Trochu's own headquarters. Trochu barely held on. A rushed plebiscite proved the government still had the people's support for now. And then, at last, a spark of hope. Gambetta had done it. His new army had struck south of Paris. Orléans had fallen, not to the Prussians, but to France. The people roared for action. If Gambetta had won, then Paris must break free, must meet him in open battle, must turn the tide of war. Trochu had planned for a breakout toward Rouen, where he believed the German lines were weakest. But with Gambetta's victory, he changed course, southeast, towards Salvation. It was the worst decision he could have made. He sent his men straight into the teeth of the strongest Prussian defenses, with almost no secrecy and no element of surprise. As if fate itself conspired against Paris, the Marne River swelled, delaying the main attack while the diversionary feint went forward, exposing the plan before it had even begun. The Prussians were waiting. But the French still fought like devils, breaking through in places and tasting victory. By November the 30th, they had crossed the river, dug in, and repelled wave after wave of Prussian counterattacks. For a moment, it seemed as if the impossible might happen. Trochu and Ducrot led from the front, their last gamble playing out in the smoke and fire of battle. But Prussian artillery ruled the field. The French line crumbled. On December the 3rd, the survivors fell back to Paris exhausted and utterly defeated. Word arrived that French forces to the north had struck back against the Germans, and with it came a renewed sense of desperation. Just before Christmas, another sortie was launched, this time toward Le Bourget. The French advanced, but the ground was frozen solid. There would be no trenches, no fortifications, only the cold and the enemy's fire. For 3 days, they fought in the ice and snow, but the story remained the same. Initial gains, brutal counterattacks, and retreat. Ducrot led his shattered men back to Paris, fewer now, gaunt from the hunger, hands and feet blackened by frostbite. The city's larders were empty. Bread was a memory. Hunger clawed at the people of Paris, and they turned to whatever they could find. Rats, dogs, cats, even the noble creatures of the city's zoo were not spared. The lions and elephants that had once delighted visitors were now nothing more than fresh meat. Moltke barely had to lift a finger. He held the line, repelling the occasional French attack, but he knew the real weapon was time. Every day that passed, the city grew weaker. But in Berlin, patience was running thin. The war had dragged on long enough. The politicians wanted it finished. Moltke objected. Starvation was already doing the work. Why waste shells? But Bismarck and the others wanted pressure, suffering, finality. On January 5th, 1871, the Prussian guns turned their sights away from the forts and onto the city itself. The first shells only hardened Parisian resolve. The city would not bow. Then on January the 18th, the final insult came, not just to Paris, but to all of France. In the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the very palace of the French monarchy, King Wilhelm of Prussia crowned himself emperor of a united Germany. It was a message that could not have been clearer. France had not just lost a war, it had lost its place in Europe. The people of Paris erupted in rage. They demanded action, a last stand, anything but silence. Trochu, knowing it was madness, agreed anyway. 90,000 men, divided into 3 columns, were sent forward on January the 19th. The cold was merciless. The fog so thick that men could barely see a few feet ahead. It wasn't a battle. It was an act of desperation. For a moment, though, hope flickered. Buzenval fell. But then the Prussian lines held, as they always had, and as they always would. The final sortie ended like all the others, in retreat. The guns pounded the city without pause. The food was gone. The people were dying by the thousands, not from bullets, but from empty stomachs and emaciated figures. The communards rose again, sensing weakness. The government, exhausted and out of options, finally bent, and the talks with Bismarck began. On January 23rd, the first meetings were held at Versailles. There was no real negotiation, only terms dictated by the victors. 5 days later, on January 28th, the war was over. The guns fell silent, the blockade was lifted, but humiliation was still to come. On March 1st, the Germans entered Paris not as liberators, but as conquerors. Bismarck knew that wars are not just won on the battlefield, but in the minds of the defeated. France would not just lose its land, it would lose face. There was no room for negotiation. Alsace and Lorraine, French for generations, were torn away and absorbed into the new German Empire. A war indemnity of 5 billion francs was imposed, a sum designed to break France's back. Paris, humiliated and starving, exploded once more. The communards took control, declaring a new commune, a last act of defiance against both the Germans and the French government itself. The Germans didn't stay long, but their presence was enough. To the radicals, it was unbearable. If the government would accept this shame, then the government itself had to fall. The new government, led by Adolphe Thiers, abandoned Paris, retreating to Versailles with its loyal troops. The Commune ruled for 10 weeks. A revolution within a revolution. In May, the French government returned with guns. The Germans stood aside, allowing Thiers' forces to retake the city in a storm of blood. 20,000 Parisians were slaughtered. The Commune itself was short-lived, but the legend of its struggle would endure, a spark that would ignite future revolutions. Quote, "The actual performance of the Commune came to be less significant than the myth it left to later propagandists of a first attempt to set up a communist state." End quote. The new French government, born out of defeat, was a conservative and pragmatic one. They wasted no time. The crushing indemnity of 5 billion francs meant to keep France on its knees was paid off with startling speed. But money was one thing. The wound to national pride was another, and France did not forget. Over the next quarter century, it scoured Europe for allies, preparing, waiting for the day it could settle accounts with Germany. The tension never faded. Colonial disputes, diplomatic maneuvering, and economic rivalries kept the fire burning. And then in 1914, the reckoning came. The cannons of 1871 fell silent, but their echoes never died. They rumbled beneath the surface of France, waiting and aching to erupt. Alsace and Lorraine were not just lost territories, they were open wounds, raw and festering, carved from the flesh of the nation. Every child born in the shadow of that defeat grew up hearing the same bitter refrain: never forgive and never forget. For the men who had surrendered, the shame was unbearable. For those too young to fight, it was an inheritance of resentment, passed from father to son, mother to daughter. France did not heal. It seethed, it plotted, it dreamed of the day when the humiliation of Sedan and the shame of Versailles would be washed away, not with ink, but with blood. And then in 1914, the world shuddered. The moment had come, the time for words was over. This was not just World War I. This was a reckoning.